Hello, everybody. We're here to talk about the new Barossa Hospital tonight. And I'd like to introduce myself first. I'm Elizabeth Haybick. I'm the HAC presiding member. So we're very pleased to have you along tonight and host this second community webinar for you all about a new hospital in our district. First of all, I'd like to have an acknowledgement of country, and I'll just read that with you. We acknowledge that this land we live and work on is the traditional lands for many First Nations, for the Kaurna, for the Ngarrindjeri, for the Perenjak, and for the Ngarrindjeri-Ramindjeri peoples. We acknowledge these peoples as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide, Barossa Hills and Fleurieu region and recognise their continuing connection to lands, waters and communities. We also pay our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and elders past, present and emerging. So, welcome all. In February this year, at the end of the first webinar, we said we'd keep the community informed about the progress of the new Barossa Hospital business case, and considerable work and progress has occurred since then. A small working group from HAC have worked alongside of the service development team for the Barossa Hills Fleurieu Local Health Network to bring this event to you today as well. Can I particularly welcome the presence and contributions today of some of the members of the Local Health Network Board, Rebecca Graham, who's the CEO of the Local Health Network, Sam Felkel, who's a team leader for SA Health Infrastructure, and Amy Foote, who's the project manager of the Service Development and Infrastructure team. And with her will be Nicholas McCrossan, a senior consultant from John Staff, and finally Jane Evans and Matt Coward, who are Barossa HAC members, will lead the Q&A. Those you may not be able to see, but are really important and been supportive and part of the success of today. The people behind the scenes on the service development team and the SA Health IT teams who are managing all the technology for us tonight. Barossa HAC members have helped in many ways for this event. I also take the opportunity to acknowledge members of the small working group, including Heather Richardson and Matt Coward and Jane Evans, for their significant contributions. And you'll meet Jane and Matt a little later when they assist in the Q&A session. We'd like to have had this as a face-to-face forum this time, but plans needed to be adapted to this online format due to the ongoing community COVID cases and the flu season being upon us too. So to keep everybody safe, we are virtual again. We do apologise for any inconvenience and really appreciate your being with us today. So we're here today to talk with you about the new Barossa Hospital and to provide you with the most current information. Over the hour that we're together, the program has been designed so you get all the up-to-date information, and importantly, in the final 20 minutes, it'll be over to you to hear responses from presenters to questions that you've asked as local community members when you registered. Also, the presenters will respond to questions you may have posed during the presentation today via your chat function, and that will happen at the end as well. I've said to you that Rebecca will come up first, and she'll provide you with that overview of all the progress of the business case. Then Sam will come along and talk to you about how the roadmap is developing in that full business case. He'll be followed by Amy to discuss how the community will now be involved in developing the business case further. And you would have seen the advertisements in the paper for expressions of interest to be a member of this group. HAC members will also be part of that too. There's been considerable work completed for the clinical planning and services planning. So she will be joined by Nicholas McCrossan, who's a senior consultant with John Staff, who will expand on how their team have gone about developing the planning, and that'll help to inform the business case. So the final 20 minutes will be the quick Q&A led by Jane Evans and Matt Cowell, members of Barossa HAC. Some very brief housekeeping before we start about being part of the webinar. Firstly, we would encourage you to use the show conversation chat button to enter any questions you may think of during the presentation. The chat button is just the one which, if you run your cursor along it, it's just like a bubble. All questions will be saved to the end of the presentation, with Jane and Matt monitoring these as we go through to have them ready for the Q&A. And we're recording this presentation too, but not the Q&A section. After the webinar, we'll forward all of you who've registered a flyer with presentation information and contact details. So if you happen to think of a question or have a comment after the session, you'll be able to submit that via an email, and we'll put that up on the screen for you at the end. And that'll make sure everybody's right up to date. The role of HAC in the new Barossa Hospital development. I think as your local representatives, we've continued to work with the region and service development team, along with others as well, about the new Barossa Hospital. Our role is to represent community views and identify issues. We've continued to consult and talk broadly across the district and advocate, most recently by being part of the professional user groups. You'll hear about those a little bit later. Meetings that John Staff have had. We've been particularly impressed by the sheer amount of detail in those generally called PUGs, professional user groups, what they go into, and the number of staff and others who are actually involved in really looking at the amount of detail. They have ensured all voices have been heard, and I hope you'll be equally impressed when you hear about it as well. So it gives me much pleasure to hand over to Rebecca Graham, CEO of the Barossa Hills Fleuro Local Health Network, to present an overview of the journey towards the new Barossa Hospital to you all. Okay, over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for all the amazing work that you and the Health Advisory Council do, particularly in your advocacy in relation to this particular project. So in preparing for today, Elizabeth, I've been reflecting on everything that's happened since we last got together in the community webinar about the new Barossa Hospital, which I think was back in February this year. And the last community webinar was held just before we were going into caretaker mode before the state election. And since then, of course, we've got a new government with a new Labor government, and of course, appointment of the new Minister for Health and Wellbeing, the Honourable Chris Picton. We've also had the Shadow Ministry appointed with the local member Ashton Hearn, or Ash, appointed as a Shadow Minister for Health and Wellbeing as well. So coming back to our reason for being here today, an update on progress. We firstly want to reassure everybody on the webinar today that we are actively progressing the government's commitment to a full business case for the new Barossa Hospital. And today we're getting together, as Elizabeth has said, to provide you an update on that progress and answer any questions that you may have, and essentially to continue that conversation with the Barossa and Health Advisory Council and you all as well. So I have had the opportunity to meet with our new minister, and he has assured us that he is committed to seeing the full business case through to completion, where it will then be tested with Infrastructure SA. So that is, to some degree, is an independent component that evaluates projects such as these that go up to it on merit, and then of course presented to government more broadly for consideration. So just as a reminder, as part of the 21-22 state budget, the original commitment, which has been maintained, is a commitment of $6 million to enable the full business case to be completed, and to look for a suitable site as well for acquisition of land. So the funding is still available, so that's very important to know, and nothing has changed from that perspective. So we are continuing to put our efforts into completing the full business case, and before progressing, of course, to looking at a particular land site. And the usual approach is to have the full business case approved before moving to land purchase, which makes perfect sense, of course. And as being quite closely involved with this project, I've personally seen just how much work has gone into the project so far, and I'm very confident that this is going to be a very well planned and very considered business case with a lot of supportive information and detail, which will provide government, provide cabinet with all the information needed in order to make a decision. And the sorts of things that have been looked at that you'll hear more about this evening is about services to be delivered, but about models of care, about workforce models, about functional design requirements, space requirements, as well as costing. So that's very typical of a business case process. And of course, options which need to be carefully considered. So I'd just like to thank the team, and Elizabeth has done that beautifully beforehand. It's been an extraordinary hard work, lots of engagement, lots of detailed information, and we look forward to talking more about the clinical service plan, overseeing the design brief, and continued progress to, of course, the full business case. So there's a lot of work that takes place to lead up to that, to do that properly. And I'm now going to hand over to Sam Felkel, a very key member of our team from the Department of Health and Wellbeing Infrastructure team, and he'll talk us through how far along the journey we are and what master planning is all about. So over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening. I'll apologise in advance, guys, if I sound a little bit hoarse tonight. I don't have COVID, but I'm safely in a room here with a sore throat. So without further ado, I'd just like to give a bit of an overview of where we're at, where we're going, and focus on what master planning involves. So let's take a look at where we are now. You can see the blue arrow there, and starting from the beginning, if you look at the little magnifying glass depicting project establishment through to that kind of site master planning point, which is the little landscape image at the bottom, it's normal to see a lot of these kind of core planning activities overlap or be revisited as other components enable the project team to retest those assumptions and build more complete models. Nothing of this complexity, like planning health facilities, progresses in a true sequential fashion as demonstrated, but this is generally the way things move forward. As we provide this update, I can say confidently that the clinical services planning for the new Barossa Hospital has come along fantastically, and I thank everyone's involvement for that. And it's also been informing discussion within the clinical and end user cohort as to propose models of care, the synergies with neighbouring facilities such as Gawler, both of the service planning and this end user consult help John staff, our consultant, to work with the team in defining functional design requirements for the project. This extends to elements such as community and allied health spaces, your medical instrument reprocessing facilities like CSSD, through to things like back of house, the kitchen and the laundry facilities. Now, with a sound model in development, we're about to commence procurement of an architectural team, quite a targeted little team to help us support the full business case planning process in preparing a site master plan. A site master plan, it provides like the skeleton of how a new hospital may take shape spatially, and it's a critical basis for informing construction. Oh, sorry, am I a bit quiet? I'll try and move that a bit closer. Sorry, thank you, Tom. Is that better, guys?
Yep.
Hopefully, sorry. The master plan provides that skeleton for how the hospital will be formed up spatially, and it's a critical basis just for informing that construction-related and recurring infrastructure upkeep costs. you can't really build an informed business case without some idea of what it means infrastructure wise. But I'll speak to that on the next slide. Once we have that site master plan and our infrastructure assumptions are a little bit more defined, our quantity surveyor RLB can prepare a capital cost estimate for us, of which we include in the full business case, along with operational costs for the facilities such as your staffing, your equipment, maintenance, power and water. All of those materials get sort of collated and we will progress them via infrastructure essays assurance framework, and that's the little gate 2 symbol on our roadmap there. As they are the state's independent infrastructure planning and assurance body. If we could just jump over to the next slide, we'll talk a bit about master planning. Thank you. So you'll see some just images on the slides here. They're not for this project. We wouldn't put I think that's a 14-story building out there, but it's just demonstrating how master planning works. It's about stacking. It's about visualizing how things may go together. The master plan does present like an overall construction and delivery development strategy, rather not a delivery strategy, but development strategy for a new hospital. And it's principally an infrastructure-centric output where the clinical services plan is obviously focused on service delivery and model of care. So what is a master plan based on? A huge amount of evidence. With the clinical services planning for the new Barossa hospital nearing completion, we build this really powerful data set and body of evidence that will inform projected trends and demands for a given service in the region, be it emergency department activity, be it renal dialysis, be it obstetrics and birthing. Now, the volume of clinical activity, i.e. the number of presentations, can then be translated into an indicative number of treatment spaces for a given service in the Barossa. These calculations are based upon like best practice utilization, how to maximize efficiency of a given treatment space. So you don't obviously sit it vacant. You want to use the space to sort of maximize your operational efficiencies. We also give consideration to staffing ratios as established in relevant industrial agreements. Once the indicative number of treatment spaces has been determined for a given service, a health facility planner can then proceed to calculate what we call a schedule of accommodation, and our project team's currently working on that. We may have discussed previously the Australasian Health Facility Guidelines. They are an invaluable resource for the planning and design of Australian health facilities, and we routinely use it within infrastructure to base our planning assumptions on. It's updated, it's peer reviewed interstate and abroad by a range of different subject matter experts and other industry professionals, both across government and non-government organisations. Now, the guidelines have prepared a number of best practice typical spatial components, like what an ED might look like, what a dialysis unit, what an inpatient unit might look like. And our project team will utilise those industry accepted guidelines and the treatment space projections that come under clinical services plan to inform our master plan. So there's a lot of things that go into this. What does the master plan actually contain? Well, it looks at how the facility might be spatially laid out and configured. That's so you can provide highly accessible and high quality care. If it's an inefficient layout, well, that's not great for the consumer or the patient. It's important to note that a master plan for a wholly new service, such as the Barossa Hospital, prevents an infrastructure proposal. It doesn't actually necessarily represent this is how it will be. It's an option and it informs our capital costings. The actual final options get determined through like a design development, a detailed design process, and that would be potentially downstream, subject to capital funding. So the master plan will consider the overall size of the facility, comprising the enclosed and unenclosed areas. That's the building footprint. It'll consider spatial adjacencies of services and functional areas in the hospital. So that's what sits next to what and why does it sit next to it. If a multi-story development is deemed a viable option, it considers how might the building may be stacked. So it might be you put your admin areas on like an upper story, so you maximize your space on the ground for adjacencies. It also looks at things like car parking, traffic solutions, what major engineering plant might be required and where might it be sized and situated. For example, your standby generators, your solar power, your ventilation. We look at how the facility might be configured to enable effective expansion of services and growth in the region. So that's a bit of a brain dump. I'm sorry guys for that whirlwind, but it's an exciting process for me. I love the front end of projects. And I will now hand over to Amy Foote, who's our project manager for service development in the Barossa Hills Fleurieu Local Health Network. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Sam. I've actually just lost the presentation, but that's okay. So thank you for that, Sam. And I just wanted to say that I'm actually here for Donna Shotton. So she put in her apologies for tonight. She can't make it. So I'm a project manager that sits on the service development team, so works for Barossa Hills Fleurieu Local Health Network. And Donna is the acting director of service development. I'd just like to acknowledge a country and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And like others, I'd also like to acknowledge the partnership that we've got with the Health Advisory Council. We've been working very closely with them on this project, and in particular around the community forums, which are a really important way to make sure that we are keeping the community up to date and allowing those questions and answers to happen. We've also got Myra Richards, who's behind the scenes, and also Tracy Rainsford, who's currently on leave but would normally be working on this project with me as well. And of course, last but not least, the infrastructure team, so Sam and also John's staff, so Nick and Adrian and the others on his team as well. So in terms of working with our community and consumers, it's really important for us to be doing that as part of this project. It's something that our team's quite passionate about, and really looking forward to sort of progressing along with that as we continue along the journey. As I said, we've been working collaboratively with the Health Advisory Council, not only in pulling these community webinars together, but also I'm regularly attending the Health Advisory Council meetings and providing regular updates. We're involving the key members of the Health Advisory Council in the project user groups, as Elizabeth mentioned. And that's been helping to inform the models of care, functional design, and also the concept planning. We're also working collaboratively with the Health Advisory Council on the Community and Consumer Business Case Reference Group, which we're looking forward to starting that probably in about the July timeframe, I think. So overall, we're really committed to making sure that the community voice is heard. It's really important to be able to weave that into the full business case as well, to make sure that we get the best outcomes for the Barossa community. So in terms of GPs and medical specialists, we've been involving them in the project user groups as well. They've been a really important voice in the planning. We've also held an additional meeting with them and with both the GPs and the medical specialists and the GP practices. And that was really to provide an update on the clinical services planning to those that haven't been able to be involved in the project user groups, and also enable those questions and feedback. So yeah, just really encouraging those conversations with all of the key stakeholders. We're also very excited to be starting the business case reference group, as Elizabeth mentioned, and we will have HAC member representation on that, but it's really an opportunity for the broader community to have their voice heard and I guess present in the full business case when it's finalised. So for that community reference group, we're actually looking to hold at least 2 forums, and we'll see how we go. There may be other ways that we can engage the broader community. We'll work with the group on that as well. But really, it's about specifically seeking input from the consumer and community perspective. And we'll cover a range of topics such as particular design elements, what's most important for people who are actually accessing and using these services. It could be safety elements, environmental considerations, and also health and wellbeing promotion. So really trying to make sure that we have that voice in the business case. I'd now like to introduce Nick McCrossan. So he's from John's staff and probably been mentioned a few times already tonight. But really this is where some of the detail of what we have been working on, and the community can really see what that detail is and just how complex that is, as I think all of us have mentioned so far. So thanks, Nick.
Thanks very much, Amy. Hi, everyone. Lovely to be here. Look, I think everyone's given a really good overview of the general process. I also just want to say it's been a real pleasure to work on this project with the BHF team and the staff on the ground across the different hospitals in BHF and the GPs, etc. There's been really a lot of interest in this project and some fantastic input. So, you know, the work we've done to date's been really exciting and great. So, I won't touch on the process too much. That's been really covered a lot. But what I want to do is actually talk to you about where we've landed from a clinical services planning perspective, and also touching on that functional design that Rebecca and Sam spoke to around, well, okay, we're having these services. What does that actually look like, broadly speaking, in terms of what a built form might start to come together as to inform the master planning? So what does the population look like? Look, this is a very quick snapshot, but look, an older age profile comparative to South Australia, a slightly lower percentage of Aboriginal people in that direct region, but just noting there's significant pockets of Aboriginal communities a little bit further north, such as in Udunda region, who would access services at the Barossa. Relatively advantaged compared to South Australia, that can be a bit misleading. There are always really significant pockets of disadvantage in every community. It's really important to have the health services to meet the needs of those disadvantaged groups in particular. Projected population growth is really interesting. If you look at it overall, 16% over about that 20-year horizon from 2016 onwards. It doesn't feel like a lot sometimes, but actually, when you look at the age profile, the highest users of the hospital services tend to be the over 65s, and they're growing at a significant rate. In fact, more than doubling in terms of people over the age of 80. And that will have a significant impact on health service needs, not only from a hospital perspective, but also from a primary care and other perspectives as well. So we expect demand to increase across the Barossa region over time. Next slide. So what are the overall service development themes that have come through? I think a really big one is a health and wellbeing focus. So it's not just a hospital, it's a health service, more broadly speaking, that links in with all sorts of other services in the community, health and social care, for example. So looking at better integration, both vertically between acute and primary care and community health services, but also across the system. So linking in with other tertiary services in a better way, enabled by virtual care, for example. Another theme that's come through is increased self-sufficiency, and by self-sufficiency we mean let's treat more residents closer to home, closer to where they live, compared to what they would have been in the past. So the merging of the services at Angaston and Tanunda into the new Barossa will enable that through greater critical mass over time. Education, training and research is another big theme that's come through. Obviously, that integration will support that as well. So looking at more students, more training opportunities, looking at some creative partnership opportunities as well with universities. There's a bit to work through there, but that's certainly part of the vision. Workforce, again, merging those services means that you have an increased number of staff collaboratively working together, and I think will really help enable the rest of the vision that we've got articulated there. And finally, networks and partnerships. So there's obviously there's still a very important relationship with the Metro LHNs, within the LHN with Gawler Health Service, for example, with other community-based providers. So certainly the part of the vision is enabling those partnerships to occur, not only from an operational perspective, but also through design, through some really clever design, in particular some of those flexible spaces related to outpatients, community health services. Go to the next slide. So what are the proposed future services? So I'll put a little asterisk here that obviously this can change a bit as I think as Sam mentioned, it's never fluid, but we've got a pretty good feel for what's been supported to date, and this is what's proposed and the steering committee's reviewed this as well. So there's a lot of support for this in terms of how the business case will come together. So there'll be Aboriginal health services, a broad range of community allied health services that are delivered by BHF, LHN. There will be community mental health services on site, emergency services, inpatient services, in particular medical and subacute, specialist outpatients, surgery and procedures, and also a few new services that aren't currently delivered from either Angaston or Tanunda hospitals. Dental services operated by SA Dental. They were there, I think, a number of years ago. They're not now, but that would be the vision to bring them back into the Barossa. Maternity services and renal dialysis and same day and day medical services. And I'll touch on these in a little bit more detail in the coming slides. Next slide. So across our Aboriginal health, community mental health services, etc., there's a vision for an increased presence of teams on site comparative to what's happening now. I've mentioned partnership opportunities with services maybe outside too, but really well aligned with health. More of those prevention and promotion activities. Services such as Aboriginal Health already do this and do this really well, but building on that, that would be part of the vision. The dental unit we mentioned in line with SA dental planning. Look, in terms of the infrastructure response, really what it needs is a range of areas, big and small. So large, all the way from large gyms through to small consult GP type consult rooms to support that broad mix of services flexibly on site. Go to the next slide. Emergency services. So again, that merging of services means obviously the activity increases and you have an increased number of staffing compared to what would be at each individual site currently. So likely some more dedicated staffing at times that may not be available in the current model, pending further workforce planning. Triaging and streaming according to severity and type of treatment required. Paediatrics needs to be considered, having paediatric specific rooms where paediatric patients can be well managed that are designed in specific ways. Mental health is a really big theme, and it has been a lot more in recent years, and really having appropriately designed mental health areas for a range of the different presentations that will be coming from a mental health perspective. Really close access to diagnostics. So obviously your imaging, X-ray and ultrasound and CT type services, point of care testing related to pathology services, etc. And obviously virtual care is a really big theme. There's a lot of work happening from a statewide perspective that will probably influence what happens in the future. But of course also from a resuscitation perspective, if a patient comes in in a particularly severe condition, that there can be some virtual support from a larger centre in those circumstances, for example. Go to the next slide. So around inpatient, medical subacute, and I will also add that in the inpatient environment, there will also be obviously some surgical patients that would get admitted on an overnight basis at times as well. So the vision is to increase that towards that more medium acuity capability compared to what currently is probably more that low to medium acuity patient. We're looking at subacute transition care packages and what are called care pods. That's supporting some of those metro patients who might be usually admitted in metro regions who are subacute and type, needing that maintenance type care. And we can really design a ward that really supports that transition back to home. A range of considerations such as palliative care, bariatric patients, mental health patients, close observation that relates to that acuity. So having some of those patients in beds near the staff station so the nursing staff can have them monitored and keep a closer eye on them comparative to some of the other patients. Isolation, being pandemic ready to an extent as we can. And paediatric patients as well would get admitted on occasion. So it's quite complex to cater for that mix of patients, but I think we've achieved that in the discussions to date. We're anticipating likely expansion of hospital in the home, and look, what we're looking at is likely 2 wards, so an acute ward and a subacute ward with a mix of single and double rooms to support that range of services flexibly. Go to the next slide. Specialist outpatient services are the other are also really important. So they would be delivered from the same area that those community allied health services that we spoke about earlier would be delivered from. So EMR is certainly part of the vision, electronic medical records. Why I mention it here is it really does support increasing those services over time. Outreach services are better enabled if EMR is in place, as well as virtual care. So as our ICT systems improve over time, I think we see the vision for more outpatient services to be delivered locally, virtually, or face-to-face. Increased presence of workforce such as nursing workforce to support those services as well over time. Pre-admission clinics, which relate to surgical services as well, nurse-led clinics. And as I said, a really integrated ambulatory service, which support the range of community health, mental health, outpatient services delivered on site. Go to the next slide. So surgical services. So look, the idea would be similar to the current scope of services. The vision for the new Barossa is primarily to focus on those elective non-emergency day and short stay surgical services, endoscopy, for example, gynecology, etc. However, with maternity services, and I'll get to that being on site, obviously cesarean sections can be planned, but can also be unplanned. So there's a need to cater for those unplanned services. We're looking at better admission processes for patients, really streamlining that process and having a dedicated day of surgery admissions area for when people arrive at the hospital, that they can get admitted in a consistent way. We're looking at having some theatres which is really sized for flexibility over time if the case mix changes in 10 or 15 years. When we've got recovery areas, we've got stage 1, which by that I mean patients come straight out of surgery. And every patient tends to go through this. There's more nursing staff there because many patients will have had a general anaesthetic and need to go through this area. And then for day patients, there'll be a stage 2 where it's chairs and you might have a drink and some food. And so that recovery area is also really important to support the mix of services. And obviously there's a range of considerations around change rooms and things to support the staff. The staff that would be working there. And I think Sam mentioned on-site sterilisation services, which is where your surgical instruments need to be sterilised, would be part of the vision as well. Next one. Maternity and neonatal services. So look, the vision is that there's no maternity services delivered currently from Angaston or Tanunda. So the vision would be to introduce low-risk maternity services on site at the new Barossa, increase the number of births delivered locally. And what we're looking actually at a labour, deliver, recover and postpartum model, and that's a bit of a mouthful. What that means is that the woman can give birth and recover and have an overnight stay if required within the same space. The traditional model is to have your birthing rooms and then having to move the woman. But the idea for continuity is that in this model, the woman wouldn't have to move, which is seen as really good from a continuity perspective. And from a continuity has come out really strongly. I think there's some work happening around it from a statewide perspective on this, from a midwifery perspective, but also from a GP and or GP obstetrician perspective. And there's a bit to work through exactly how the model will work, but continuity is coming through really strongly. There'll be an assessment room for if a woman comes in and needs to be assessed to understand if she's actually giving birth, for example. So that's the assessment room. And a range of spaces to support families, such as a patient lounge, and access to outdoor areas also seen as really important as well from the maternity unit. Go to the next slide. Renal dialysis and day medical services. So again, there's no renal dialysis currently in the Barossa, but the vision is to introduce that service to meet increasing demand across the whole region and reduce the need for that travel. Often these patients do need to access these services three days a week. It can be significant impost on them to travel. Day medical infusions as well is also part of the vision, and that may include chemotherapy in the longer term as well. At the moment, the vision is probably to maintain most of those services at Gawler Health Service and develop those, but certainly that can be part of the vision in the longer term. And that would be co-located services, so you'd have day medical and renal dialysis as an integrated day unit. Get to the next slide. Clinical support and facility support. So you can't operate a hospital. We've spoken a lot about clinical services, but you cannot operate a hospital without the support services in place. You need your imaging and pathology and pharmacy services. You need, I spoke about EMR. There's also a lot of talk about ubiquitous Wi-Fi, but that we mean for staff and patients wherever they might be across the whole facility. Electric vehicles as part of the fleet services. By that I mean the cars that the community health services, for example, need to utilise to see patients in their homes. So certainly technology is really coming through very strongly. An on-site kitchen, there may be on-site cafe and or retail. That will be dependent on the site business case moving forward. Education training areas to support staff and students. And the full range of those, what we call back of house services to support the services to operate. So you've got, engineering and supplying all the goods on site, and obviously cleaning and waste and all those things that you need for a hospital to actually operate. So they've all been considered as well to date. I think that's it from me. So I will hand over to Jane and Matt. Thank you very much.